Okay, so having read ahead earlier today, I recalled that the first will section is quite long. It's really long, um, really long, and the the general will section that precedes it has this. I find unpalatable comparison between Jung's concept of introversion and extroversion and the will element or function. So I think what I'll do is I'll just kind of like read that and pick it apart and then do the first will section separately. So he calls it peace as will and representation. Don't know what that translation is supposed to mean. But anyway, it may seem strange, but will as a component of psychological systems is quite rare, although not a single psychologist has undertaken or will undertake to deny its significance for the human psyche. The explanation for this phenomenon, I think, should be sought in the unidentified and universal nature of the will itself. She, like the Holy Spirit, is invisible, omnipresent, blows wherever she wants, and therefore is difficult to catch in a network of psychological techniques. The implicit but powerful participation of the will in the creation of psychological systems can be studied especially clearly using the example of Carl Gustav Jung's typology. On the one hand, Jung stated that will and memory are not included in his typology, but in fact, will was the main differentiating principle of Jung's typology. Jung's division into introverts and extroverts has already entered into everyday life and has become commonly used, and at the same time, this division is generally understood in such a way that an extrovert is an outward facing, very sociable person, while an introvert is an uncommunicative person turned inward. But this is kitchen Jung. In fact, an extrovert is not a person turned outward, but a person dependent from the outside, and an introvert is the opposite. Here are some characteristic quotes from you. Okay, and before we even go into this, right? It's like, to me, it would make sense that an extrovert, or backing up for a second, the second and fourth functions, which are like others positive, they're receptive and kind of like fearless about outside influence, right? Normative and indifferent. Wouldn't that make sense that those were like the extroverted parts of a type, right? And then the first and the third are others negative, and they are wary of the influence of the other. So, to me, that would seem introverted, and in in keeping with Jung's actual terminology. I've read Psychological Types twice all the way through, and I've read Chapter 10, where he really goes into the system many times. And so, in my opinion, uh, the parallels are between the first and third functions and the second and fourth. But I guess I'll continue. um, Here are some characteristic quotes from Jung's typology. The unconscious claims of the extroverted type are, strictly speaking, primitive and infantile, egocentric in nature. The extroverted type is always ready to give himself, apparently, in favor of the object and to assimilate his subjectivity to the object. The danger for an extrovert is that he gets involved in objects and completely loses himself in them. The mental life of a given personal type plays out, so to speak, outside of himself in the environment. He lives in others and through others. Any reflection on himself makes him shudder. The dangers lurking here are best overcome by noise. If he has a complex, he takes refuge in social circles, turmoil, and allows himself to be assured several times a day that everything is in order. If he does not interfere too much in other people's affairs, is not too pushy, and is not too superficial, he can be a distinctly useful member of any community. If he has a complex, he takes refuge in social. Okay, this might be okay. That repeats itself. Okay. Um, the problem of, and I do wonder. He gives that example, that quote for extroversion. I'm kind of assuming that the repeated part here is just like taping over the introverted quote that he was going to give. So unfortunately, there was probably a quote regarding introversion, although of course it's the exact opposite of extroversion. Now notice in here that he says, he takes refuge in social circles. He takes in from the environment, like he loses himself in the object. I mean, to me, that seems others positive, so to speak. It's like the second and fourth, right? Uh, the problem of extroversion and introversion is not in the degree of sociability, contact, but in the degree of dependence or independence of the individual, i.e., it is a problem of will. Uh, and so dependence would seem to me to be extroversion, right? Because you're dependent on the object versus the introvert who's independent, right? And the first function is the independent function. Dot dot dot. Uh, and the third function tries to make itself independent. Okay, neurotically so. Uh, it is a problem of will, and in fact, dividing humanity into extroverts and introverts, Jung divided it into people with a high-ranking will and a low-ranking will, and only then he singled out from extroverts and introverts people of a thinking type, sensory, emotional, and intuitive, i.e., developed his typology, deriving types from the volitional base of man. However, not belonging to strong-willed people, Jung himself tried to camouflage his personal problem as much as possible, and creating his typology hid the problem of will behind vague terminology, and, as already quoted, even officially brought will beyond the boundaries of his typology. So, is he saying here that extroverts are high-ranking will and introverts are low-ranking will? Because aren't extroverts dependent upon the object, whereas introverts are independent? I mean, you would think that, but I don't know. It's a weird contradiction. I don't understand if the translation is just wrong. It's possible. Um, I don't particularly like it anyway, but it clearly has there's multiple questions and problems going on here. Although Jung's indisputable excuse can be that will is the most secretive element of the human psyche, and there is nothing in the world that can be pointed to as the obvious fruit of will, while there are any number of traces of emotional logic and physics. But there is nothing in human life that is not filled with will, that does not reflect the place of will in the order of functions of the individual. But all this is only secret hidden. For example, it is customary to talk about the Egyptian pyramids as the greatest creation of human hands, but slave labor was preceded by the thoughts of Egyptian engineers. But that's not all. The hands and thoughts were preceded by the will of the pharaoh. The pharaoh said, I want a pyramid, and that's where it all began. Engineers and slaves were only a derivative of the invisible pharaoh's will. Will is a mental component hidden from view, therefore only those who feel the redundancy of the volitional principle in themselves, i.e., holders of the first will, are able to more or less clearly distinguish within themselves the dull, deep bass of the will behind the choir of piercing trebles of the other functions. One of these people, Lermontov, wrote, the will contains the whole world. To want means to hate, to love, to regret, to rejoice, to live, in a word. Will is the moral force of every being, the free desire to create or destroy something, the imprint of the divine, the creative power that creates miracles out of nothing. And remember earlier in the book he compared the will to the spirit. The logic is like mind, emotion, the soul, and physics like the body, and the will is the spirit. Okay? Someone will consider Lermontov's words an exaggeration, but in fact there is no exaggeration in them. I can say more. The position of the will at the levels of the functional hierarchy greatly influences the legal norms of a person, completely shapes ethics, unwritten law, an individual picture of society and the universe. In general, being one of the functions and subject in its action to the same principles and patterns as the others, the will is at the same time the invisible core of the entire order of functions. Personally, I don't know about that. I don't. I'm just. I guess I'm agnostic technically about this idea that kind of will is like more important or more central than the other functions. I mean, maybe it is. Again, this can be a subject for another video because my thoughts are not fully formed on this one. But I guess I just don't like it. I kind of want these like four equal modular, aspects, and each having their own kind of like individual spot. But there is something about like will. There is something about it that seems transcendent, right? And I don't know. I kind of like intuitively want these to be like egalitarian, the aspects, but that doesn't mean they have to be. Okay, so accordingly, which is a little meta as we'll get into. Accordingly, the first will is all, as it were, a monologue, exis, result, individualism. The second will is all, as it were, a dialogue, a norm, and a process. The third will is all, as it were, complex, total vulnerability. The third will is all, as it were, complex, meaning like having a complex, total vulnerability. Actually, I'm not sure if that's how I meant it. Whatever. This is stupid. Just take it as it's written. The fourth will is all, as it were, wax, dependence, and omnivorousness. Therefore, without canceling anything that was said before, I will pay special attention. The position of the will in the functional hierarchy is of decisive importance for the human psyche. And although by the words character, personality, we usually understand the sum of the mental properties of an individual, in fact, this is first of all the will, and only then, as an appendage, the remaining functions. Depending on the position of the will at the levels of the functional hierarchy, society is divided into kings, or as he calls them, czars, which is first will, nobles, second will, Philistines, third will, and serfs, fourth will. So I'll leave it there, and I'm going to make a separate video for first will because it's very long.